this was the job that she's always wanted, and unfortunately she didn't make the right decisions to keep it.
Those were the words of Councilman Kristerfer Burnett on his perspective regarding now former Mayor Catherine Pugh, as he sits down with me one-on-one for this premiere episode of Policy Perspective with MrPolitics. Councilman, thank you for joining us. Now let's jump right into it. I've had a chance to observe your service to the citizens of not only the 8th District, but the city of Baltimore as a whole over the past, 2.5 years now, and has really witnessed your growth and your style of leadership, which I can say you've done a yeoman's job, at least in my opinion, in focusing your attention not only just on policy proposals, and we'll get into some of those here on this program, but your attention to detail in the neighborhoods throughout your district. Most people don't realize that Charm City is known as a city of neighborhoods. And you have seemed to be laser focused on housing issues in particular. What has shaped your perspective on this?
So the housing piece, I'll start there. For me, neighborhoods are the backbone of the city of Baltimore. We have over 255 of them. And for a long time, most of the focus was on downtown and not the outer west side where I represent, or outer east side where some of my colleagues are fighting every day. And so I felt that housing in itself is a stabilizing factor. So when we look at the most blighted communities, where we have the highest density levels of vacancy, that's also where you have the highest levels of violence, the highest amounts of illegal dumping, the rats, trash, asthma rates. I mean, everything that we say we want to fix in the city is concentrated in the same areas, and has been for a long time. And a lot of that ties to the history of blockbusting and redlining in Baltimore, which is a whole other episode, but that systemic disinvestment has existed for a long time, and it starts in neighborhoods. And so we know that if we can fix up the housing conditions, if we can provide affordable housing for low-income families that's stable and quality, then we've laid that foundation for them. So if you have, if you're not housing insecure and you have a place to lay your head at night that's safe and secure for you and your family, that means the probability of you not calling out for work sick is a lot higher. The probability that your kids are going to be able to get to and from school walking safely is a lot higher. The health impacts of living in an environment that's green, that's clean, at least a better outcome for people. And so, we're sitting in my office right now, and the only map I have on the wall is the one with all the vacant houses on it. That's also where I can tell you I spend most of my time as an elected official, walking through the alleys every single Friday, hosting pop-up resource fairs, trying to really, again, leverage resources for the areas that have not been a priority, in my opinion, for elected officials for a very long time in Baltimore. And I know that if I can really focus on those areas, those folks that have not seen the level of investment intention, that we can really turn things around. And not that I'm ignoring the stronger parts of my district, because I do have some beautiful neighborhoods that are stable and secure, but I also understand that they stay that way by making sure that we invest in the areas that haven't had that attention, because there's an old saying, when we all do better, we all do better. And so while I do work on a diverse set of issues in West Baltimore, ranging from deer and parks to the northern part of my district, but I also have gun violence and disinvestment in schools and water fountains that you can't drink out of. And so we focused a tremendous amount of time on that neighborhood piece, that neighborhood engagement, that housing piece. Human trafficking wasn't something that I knew a whole lot about, nor did I run on, but I had a constituent come out to me one day at a community meeting and said that a student of hers at Western High School had gone missing and was found in D.C. and was believed to have been trafficked. And she literally said to me, "Councilman, you got to do something about this. Nobody's working on human trafficking in Baltimore City. It's a big issue, especially affecting our young people, our young kids." And I didn't know much about it, so I reached out to my colleague, Councilman Cohen, who's the chair of the Youth and Education Committee, and asked that we call a hearing. which we did, and we brought out every nonprofit, every city agency, every law enforcement agency, the school system, a whole wide range. It was the biggest hearing we'd actually organized at that point to date, to really get a full lay of the land and perspective on what was being done to protect our kids and vulnerable families in Baltimore, and that we're being, because trafficking was something that is flown under the radar, but it's the modern form of slavery. You look at globally, I mean, that folks are being trafficked at exponential rates at levels we haven't seen and taken advantage of. It also boils down to even the LGBTQ community and the trans community are specifically susceptible to it. I think something like 70% of trans kids that are homeless end up being trafficked. And we also know that 1 in 4 runaways in Baltimore City is likely to encounter a trafficker within 48 hours. And so in that hearing was probably the hardest one to hear all of these statistics and to hear the struggles that service providers have had at kind of providing beds and providing resources and trying to get people out of that life and back into some stability. But what was also clear was that there was not a lot of uniformity in the response and continuity in the response on the government side. And so after that hearing, we started the Baltimore City Human Trafficking Collaborative, the first of its kind. And we have over 55 members, ranging from government organizations. The same folks that were at that hearing are now on this task force working together. We've been in operation for over a year. That has led to the establishment of over $300,000 in grant funds for Baltimore-based organizations that help victims of trafficking, a much-needed investment. We actually got our first round of grants out this spring, which was a big deal for those organizations who hadn't seen that kind of investment from Baltimore City in their history. We've also done trainings across the city in areas that we know this is a hot topic, or that the issue of prostitution and sex work is a hot topic, while with the intention being to help people delineate between people who are voluntarily engaging in sex work, and a lot of times it may be survival sex or just something that they choose to do, which my personal opinion is if that's what you choose to do, fine. But if you don't want to be there and you want a way out, or you're being coerced into it, we should have as much institutional support for you from city government and from the nonprofit folks to provide that support for people who want a way out. And it also ties in the other issues. I mean, violence is a huge issue in Baltimore City, but a lot of folks don't know that there is intersectionalities between gun violence, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. And in fact, for some gangs, human trafficking is a revenue source for them to be able to buy other guns and drugs. And so when we look at violence reduction in Baltimore City, this has to be a key piece of that, because you have vulnerable people that are being taken advantage of for money, and that money is being used to funnel and fuel the violence that we see every day in our neighborhoods. It also intersects with the opioid crisis that we have in Baltimore City. A lot of the focus is on gun violence, and last year we had over 300 murders, but there were also over 800 opioid deaths, the highest in the region. In Baltimore City, and we know that one of the ways that traffickers use to coerce the victims is through drug addiction, and so they feed that addiction and push them into that life. We've also passed several bills working with the hotel industry. We've now have it so that every hotel room, bar, restaurant, massage parlor, anywhere we had any oversight over, in the next year and a half, we'll have to post in every restroom information on the human trafficking hotline. We've expanded training for hotel workers in every hotel in Baltimore City, which when it was previously they got trained one time when they got hired, which doesn't help you if you've been in a place for 5 years and you may not really know what to look for. Now we have training every 2 years that's required for all hotel employees in every hotel in Baltimore City. And so those have been 2 areas that I've spent a lot of time on. And then the last being sort of tied into this issue of, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but the issue of impeachment, but also finance and money. And it's something that you and I have worked together on, which was campaign finance reform and trying to establish a public financing model that takes money, big donors and special interest influence out of the equation and really invest in everyday community residents, so that small candidates who come from community work like I did, running a farmer's market, serving my community association, not having a political dynasty behind me, but more importantly, just people power and being fueled by that, and making sure that we have a viable system that if candidates choose to take public financing and not big money donors and large contributions, that we'll have a matching program that we're working on to basically change the dynamic. And we've seen this work in other places where candidates commit to this, and it's not necessarily necessarily easier to raise money using only small donations from Baltimore City residents, but it does increase civic engagement. It empowers residents to have a greater voice and seat at the table in City Hall, and it allows for candidates who don't have those big money connections to have a real shot at winning elections in Baltimore City.
Well, most people think that we passed that last year, right? It was a charter amendment that you diligently got through the council, got to the voters, and yet while it passed, they're still working on something now. What is that something now that needs to be passed as well?
So the voters passed Question H, which established a commission to have oversight over the Fair Election Fund, and it created the fund itself, sort of the bank account for us to direct money to. So a quick civics lesson for folks listening: the council can't move money in the budget unless we're authorized by the charter. And so there's a few provisions in which we can pass legislation that creates a dedicated revenue source for a type of program. So that's the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which was passed in 2016 by the voters, and now Question H, which is the Fair Election Fund, which allows us to leverage money and move money into that area of the budget. So that was passed in November. Now we have to really build out what the program will look like, and that's still in process. So we are, still working to figure out, how much should the match be, what are the caps that we will allow, the size of the contribution that the candidate would be able to accept, how large the match is. I think I said that already. Is there a reset? How does this interplay between the primary election and the general election? We want to make sure that this program is viable for not only, for a long time there's been a lot of debate about the Democratic Party's control in Baltimore City, but, my personal opinion is that this should be a program that's viable for anybody, regardless of party affiliation, or if they have no affiliation at all, that we want to make sure that the general election matters and that people come out and that you can raise money in the general election and really make sure that the best ideas are what's driving elections in Baltimore City, not who has the most money. And so we are working diligently on the second ordinance that we're hopeful we'll to introduce in the next couple weeks, but still working out some kinks. But the operation is underway, and we'll be working with Mayor Young to try and get funding available from the general fund into this fund, so that when the program comes online in 2024, that it's a program that candidates want to be a part of, that incumbents want to be a part of, and that really shows that we can have a viable system of public financing, for elections in Baltimore, which we already have a substantial level of investment from public dollars into primaries that are party driven. So it's not really, I've gotten some feedback from folks saying, well, why should we put public money into politics? Well, we do that every time. I mean, there are millions of dollars spent on elections every 2 years, and those primaries are locked in between Democrats and Republicans, and those are private entities that are receiving public dollars to put on elections. And so this is just adding another layer to that in saying that if you're willing to commit to not taking big money donations and really want to grind it out and get as many small donations as possible, that we'll match that and we'll get behind that effort, because at the end of the day, it should be people over money. And we've seen, all of the events that have occurred with this previous administration now, and a lot of the red flags were around public financing and where the money was coming from. I mean, financing an election. So I think the timing is right. I think once we get the second ordinance in, there'll be a lot of dialogue about it. I'm happy to come back on and talk about it in further detail as to what the system is actually going to look like and why it's important, because we're going to need to continue to educate people as to what this is all about, because it's new for Baltimore, and it's something we've never seen before. But we've seen it work in Montgomery County, we've seen it in Howard County, we've seen it in Seattle and New York, where viable candidates and have been doing a great time. Heck, we've seen it in Maryland. Governor Hogan used public financing when he ran back in 2014. So it's something that I think if it's good for other places, it's good for Baltimore.
All right, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Now, when we speak about campaign finance reform, in 2016, we witnessed the first ever decertification of election results here in the city of Baltimore. Now, that was thanks in large part to the men and women of Voice, voters organized for the integrity of city elections. And I have to say, in full disclosure, I was a founding member of this body, and we uncovered hundreds of voting irregularities that led to this first ever decertification, and it actually helped prompt me to bring you the campaign finance reform bill that you so successfully pushed through the council when the voters passed it just last year. But the problem was the council was shockingly silent during this whole election fiasco in 2016. Nobody ever held accountable. Absolutely no oversight committees were formed to investigate these actions, and legislation wasn't even introduced to reform the system. However, now that we've seen the feds raid City Hall and the mayor forced from office due to what appears to be illegal, or at the very least, unethical behavior, thanks to these hundreds of thousands of dollars of purchases of these healthy Holly books, we've witnessed several reform bills introduced by you and your colleagues over the past few weeks. Your bill in particular calls for establishing a process of impeachment of a city mayor by the members of the city council. Now, some folks believe that it goes too far, while others feel like it just doesn't go far enough. What's your perspective on this policy, and what do you hope to accomplish with this bill?
So I want to take a step back and really explain why I started looking at this, because I've seen some comments online saying that this is politically motivated or a shot at former Mayor Pugh, and I'd like to note that that is not the case. While we didn't agree on everything from a policy perspective, I think I had a pretty good working relationship with Mayor Pugh, and so this was not any direct shot. But when everything broke, I'm walking my dog, I'm going to the grocery store, and people are stopping me everywhere. What's the council going to do about this? Why aren't you guys acting on this? And so that was the impetus for our initially, we had 14 of us that signed on to a letter asking for resignation after the Kaiser Permanente story broke, which showed that there was a lack of disclosure about a business relationship before a vote, which is a pretty clear ethics violation. I mean, all of us fill out finance reports every year, and we have to disclose, and some of my colleagues have abstained from voting on bills because of relationships that they have with that industry, and you should be transparent about that. And so, it forced me to look into the charter and see what already existed, what actions could we take, and what I found was that the council did already have existing impeachment authority, but it only applied to the council president's office and the comptroller's office. And I was shocked to see that they were actually, and I spoke about this online, so I know some of your listeners read those comments, I was actually incorrect in my assertion that the council already had the authority to impeach other council members. We actually didn't. We could censor them and remove them off of committees and really limit their ability to do the work if they were found to be committing criminal acts, but could not remove other council members and could not remove the mayor. And so for me, it was, well, look, we are a very important check in the system of government. We're supposed to be the check and the balance. And the executive branch should have the same authority that the legislative branch should have the same authority that the legislative branch has in the Maryland General Assembly and in Congress. And so we should be able to hold other council members accountable for their actions, and we should be able to hold the mayor's office accountable. And that was the intention of introducing this charter amendment, was to expand the level of accountability to the council. We also made some changes to the types of things that impeachment proceedings could be triggered by. It was very vague initially, or is very vague because this hasn't been passed yet. But we wanted to make sure, one, that there was a very high threshold for removal. So we raised the threshold from 2/3 to 3/4 for the council president, the comptroller, the mayor, and the council, so that it requires a very high bar, almost unanimous support from the council. We also added in language to require a series of public hearings led by the Judiciary and Legislative Investigations Committee, which has subpoena powers. We also want to involve the Inspector General. And then in the bill, we also reference that if this is passed by the voters, we will introduce changes to the council rules to really be clear and lay out what this process should look like, so that it's as transparent as possible, so that the voters have a clear voice in any process that hopefully we never have to use. For the record, my intention is that I hope this is never something that comes up in the Baltimore City Council, but it's important for us to have it as a tool in a toolbox. But we want to make sure that there are very clear and concise rules around how this is used, and so those are things that we're going to be moving.
So the impeachment isn't sparked by necessarily a charge or a conviction of a charge. This can be something that somebody is alleged to have done that's not actually charged by a state's attorney or a state prosecutor.
So we do have in there that it would be the commission of a felony or misdemeanor while in office, which I'd note that right now it only had misdemeanor, which is important. I've gotten some feedback on that, but I would, I have one individual say, well, a speeding ticket is a misdemeanor. Well, I would say so is perjury, which is a more relevant misdemeanor to what we're talking about here. But we added felony. We added willful neglect of duty, misconduct in office, incompetence, and any charges leveraged by the Inspector General that may not fit into that. So yes, I mean, now we're sort of worked into like the theory of impeachment, and should that be a power that anybody has? That, because you're right, it is separate from the criminal justice system, and so I think that's where the public debate around this comes in, and that we'll have a number of hearings about this. I've talked to my colleagues about doing a tour of the city, because there were a number of charter amendments that have been introduced and will be introduced in the coming weeks. So waiting to see when we have a full scope of what's being considered and really taking that out, because you're right. I mean, this is something that does not have to be triggered by a conviction. But my hope is that, we have a council that would not take this action lightly, and that would really understand the magnitude of that decision. But I would note that the General Assembly has this exact power, and right now there's a whole bunch of debate about impeachment for Donald Trump, and he hasn't been convicted of anything, for the record. So, but we know he has done some things, and so for me, the feedback I've gotten around that is, well, if it's good for Congress, why shouldn't it be good for the council? And in fact, I'd argue that by us being a smaller body, it's a lot easier to hold us accountable than the 141 members of the House of Delegates in Annapolis. If they were to take that level, that those actions, or the 40-something senators,
or 435 members of the House,
right? The congressional level,
that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. Like 15 of us, the spotlight's on us and a lot more with a microscope than any other position, I would argue, in the state of Maryland. We don't have a problem getting media attention for anything that we're doing, but more importantly, I believe that my colleagues on this council, and my hope is that for future councils, if this is ever a consideration, would understand that this isn't something that should be used as a political threat, that this is something that should be used when the confidence of the voters of the city of Baltimore has been irreparably fractured. And I believe that has occurred in this situation. And, we had unanimous support from the council to ask for a resignation. And so I think if this did exist right now, these proceedings probably would be moving forward right now. But it doesn't mean they'd be swift or fast. My hope is that if something like that was to occur, that there would be a tremendous amount of deliberation and thought put into this action, because folks are right. I mean, this is a big deal. It is not taken lightly by me or anyone else that co-sponsored this, and it's, again, something that I don't want to ever have to use. I don't want to have to take a vote like that. My hope is that we would have the events that have unfolded will serve as a lesson learned for not only existing elected officials in the state of Maryland and in Baltimore City, but for folks who are running that. We need people with integrity. We need people who are here to do the will of the people and nothing else. And that's what we're here to do.
Some of the arguments online, which I think is apples and oranges, but I want to get your take on it. We're calling saying, well, why impeachment instead of recall, right? Mm-hmm. Give it to the people, which can be done separately in a different piece of legislation. What's your take on the difference between the two, and do you know if recall will be added later on down the line, not just to this bill, but maybe as a separate piece of legislation by somebody else? Or?
So my understanding, and I still need to dig in a little bit further, but my initial read on it is that we would need first authorization from the state to do that, to even consider it. So I'm not certain that any of my colleagues have dug deeper into that idea, but my read on it is that we need the General Assembly to authorize that first. So again, if I'm, we can do a follow up if I'm incorrect on that, but that's my take on the theory of recalls. I'm not big on it. Not a huge proponent, and I'll say why. And I'm not necessarily opposed either. I think it's something that I think all ideas should be on the table. And so I agree with folks online that this is something we should consider. But a couple things I'll say. one, the reasons that were in some of the commentary I read to do that was, yes, we should put the will of the people first, but it was also a distrust of the 15 members of the council. But that's the whole representative part of our government. So if we can't trust the 15 people that we elect with everyday decisions that we make, why elect them at all? Like, every decision should go to the people, but instead you give us these 15 people power over the budget, power over the legislative process, power over what happens in the city of Baltimore. And we turn out for elections. Not enough people are turning out, but a good number are turning out every 2 years to put people in to represent them. We have a representative form of government. So I don't see how this is outside of the scope of that you put people in that represent your interests, and then you hold them accountable in the next election cycle. So if somebody gets impeached for a speeding ticket, my hope is that all 15 members will be unelected in the next cycle, because that's ridiculous. I don't see that occurring. But if it did, then we got bigger problems at play, if that's what we're impeaching people for. The other side of it, I'll say, is that we can't pretend that elections aren't swayed by outside influence every single time. I mean, you can look at the election of Donald Trump and the role that the Russians have played at spreading misinformation. We can look at internationally with Brexit and, putting that up for referendum without giving people adequate information, and outside influencers swaying public opinion. These are two very recent examples of fake Facebook pages and fake misinformation being put out. We've seen that in Baltimore elections. Heck, one of the people I've seen promoting this idea was subject to some of that in their own election, where misinformation was allegedly put out about that candidate, and it influenced the way people voted. And so what would stop in a recall a wealthy benefactor saying, look, I'm tired of this mayor, let me start financing billboards and media and misinformation on social media to get people riled up, pay for the signatures to get on, and next thing you know, we have a $4 million election on our hands that's being pushed by, individual beef, which we know has happened at every level of government. Wealthy folks have influenced elections. We know this. And so, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't trust the will of the people. We should listen to them. This is what my whole job is working with the people. But I also believe that I believe in representative government, and I believe that, I'll speak for myself. I'm at some 30-something community meetings per month sometimes, and so I'm hearing what people want, and so I feel like I represent that. That we don't always agree on everything with 100% of my constituents. However, I feel like the work that I've done has been based on, grounded in the work the things that I'm hearing in the community, that I'm seeing in the community, and those are how I'm making those decisions. And the decision to impeach somebody would not be one that I took lightly, and would not be one where I did not feel that was representing the will of the people.
Councilman, it's definitely been a pleasure having you on this premiere episode of the Policy Perspective podcast. And I got one last question for you before I let you go. Many of your colleagues have been rumored to be considering a citywide run in this upcoming 2020 mayoral election. And we got less than 365 days before the all-important April 28th primary. Will you be running citywide, or do you plan to run for re-election in the 8th Councilmatic District?
I will be seeking re-election to represent the 8th District. I'll be kicking off in June. Stay tuned on that. And I just feel like I have a lot more to learn in this role. It's only been 2 years, and I feel like a toddler learning to walk, but finally learning how to walk and understand how this all plays out. And so I feel like I have a lot more to learn before really considering higher office.
We hope you enjoyed this premiere episode of Policy Perspective with MrPolitics, and hope you continue to tune into our upcoming podcast. If you have a suggestion on an interview that you want to hear from an elected official, not just in Baltimore, but across the state of Maryland, hit us up at info@dmvdaily.news, or message us on Facebook or Twitter at DMV Daily News, and we'll be sure to consider your request. This podcast is a production of the DMV Daily Media Group, a multimedia production company specializing in live stream radio and podcast productions, such as the award-winning daily news show, the DMV Daily Radio Show. Support for DMV Daily comes from you, the listeners, as we remain an independent media outlet reporting on the issues you want to hear for, of, and by the people. You can further our efforts by going to www.paypal.me/DMV Daily News and donating whatever you feel comfortable in contributing. We thank you in advance.